It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Long before the movies Airplane and The Naked Gun, Leslie Nielsen was a pretty serious actor, and thanks to the success of this film in 1956, Nielsen became a fairly decent star. Now, obviously, the two comedies I mentioned would make him a household name and a major star, but he had decades of appearances in various movies and TV shows. Of course, this movie that launched his career was 1956's Forbidden Planet. While Nielsen was the leading man and action hero of the movie, he was only the third billed actor. Walter Pidgeon leads the film as Dr. Edward Morbius. Part of this is likely because a decade before, Pidgeon was a twice-over Oscar nominee. At the same time of this movie, he was also the president of the Screen Actors Guild, so honestly, I guess when you cast the president of your union, I guess you got to make him the lead. But the other lead of this movie is Anne Francis. Now, she would later be immortalized along with this movie thanks to the theme song, science fiction double feature for the Rocky Horror Show and the movie adaptation Rocky Horror Picture Show. Frances got started as a child model in the 30s to help her family through the Great Depression. And damn, I mean, that's some serious weight for a 5-year-old to take on to help her family survive the Great Depression. But by the time she was 17, she was making her film debut. Now, Forbidden Planet was by far her best-known movie. But a decade later, Frances starred in Honey West, a crime drama TV series, and she continued to work until 2004 after appearing on a ton of different TV shows for decades. Now, the most famous co-star of this movie, without a doubt, is Robbie the Robot. Now, Robbie was used on the poster to sell the movie, but spoiler alert, he's not the villain that he appears to be in the promotional materials, but it works nicely as a selling tool. And he was designed by the MGM art department, and the studio's prop department would ultimately build the full-size creation, but production designer Buddy Gillespie and art director Arthur Lonergan technically designed Robbie with writer Irving Block, and that would go through some refinement from production illustrator Minter Hubner and draftsman Robert Kinoshita. And Robbie was expensive, but MGM spared no expense to build this creation because I think they realized that this was something that they could really get a lot of legwork out of, particularly on the promotional side of things. But if we were to put the money they spent into today's money after all of the inflation and whatnot, Robbie cost over $1 million, and he was roughly 7% of the film's total budget. But man, did it pan out. And they got their money's worth. I mean, Robbie appeared a year later in the MGM movie The Invisible Boy. Then he showed up in a bunch of other TV shows, including an episode of Lost in Space, in which he battled their robot, another very famous automaton. Now, he also appeared in Gremlins, and in Gremlins, when you see him, he's actually reciting his first few lines of this movie. He also appears in Looney Tunes Back in Action in 2003. But Robbie became the most expensive film prop ever when it was auctioned in 2017 for $5,375,000. But beyond Robbie being the most indelible thing from Forbidden Planet, the movie itself would go on to be extremely influential. It's often cited as one of the earliest examples of techno horror, and there are two franchises I definitely want to call out. But Stephen King used Altair 4 in The Tommyknockers. RoboCop executive producer suggested the Krell's underground machine complex for the look of the villainous OCP's headquarters interiors. And the title has been referenced time and again. But the two franchises of note that this movie influenced were Star Trek and Doctor Who. Now, Doctor Who's connections are relatively straightforward. The fourth Doctor serial, Planet of Evil, directly adapted key elements from this film's plot. And I would also argue an earlier serial from Fourth Doctor's era, one I've talked about on the show too, is also somewhat influenced by this movie, The Brain of Morbius. The Doctor and Sarah Jane land on a planet where a man is doing secret lab or secret kind of sciencey stuff and creating a new body for a dread Time Lord named Morbius. Now, that's the same as the Walter Pidgeon's character's name. So naturally, the Brain of Morbius was more influenced by Frankenstein, but come on. Morbius is not just some name you pull out of nowhere, unless you base that on the living vampire at Marvel. But I kind of doubt that's going to be anywhere remotely the possibility there. But Star Trek was heavily influenced by this movie. The Enterprise's registry number, NCC 1701, well, the number 1701 comes from a line from the movie referencing that number in particular. Altair 4 is referenced many times in Star Trek as a whole. In Star Trek 3, Dr. McCoy orders Altair water at a bar. And I also believe that the Nielsen character of Commander John J. Adams was probably a template for Captain James T. Kirk and possibly even Captain Christopher Pike before Kirk in the original Star Trek pilot episode, The Cage. But one more thing that this movie has influenced. At one point, Morbius tells Commander Adams that the Krell species had adamantine alloys. Later, Marvel Comics would introduce a substance named adamantium, an unbreakable, indestructible material that is most associated with the X-Man Wolverine. But before we start with this movie, I think one thing that I think also maybe kind of ties a little bit to Star Trek, in particular in Anne Francis' character and the way that she's dressed. She is oftentimes dressed in very short, very sparkly kind of outfit that looks almost like an alien fabric. That is all over Star Trek. Also, there is a unique horniness to this movie that is a little surprising, because it is, I mean, at times it almost seems like this is going to turn into an Adam and Eve type of story where all of a sudden, you're questioning whether it's the biblical Adam and Eve or the adult magazine Adam and Eve, that the guys are so instantly horny whenever she shows up. That's also, that is very clear that Gene Roddenberry took heavy influence in this and the relationship between men and women, how women dress, the attitudes that people hold, and the way of life for some of the people in Star Trek episodes. But also, because this movie starts off in the 23rd century, that's also the time frame that was given to Star Trek in the original series. But we are going to get into the movie where we are following the United Planet starship C-57D on their mission to Altair 4. Now, about 20 years before the start of this movie, the ship Bellerophon was sent to the star system, and C-57D, led by Commander Adams, is sent to determine what happened to that ship. And when they arrive in orbit of Altair 4, they don't see any kind of infrastructure, technology, or cities. But they are hailed by Dr. Edward Morbius and told to turn around and not attempt any landing for their own safety. Adams ignores this warning and decides to land anyway. When they arrive, they are met by Robbie the Robot. Adams and his lieutenants Jerry Farman and Doc Ostro are transported by the robot to Dr. Morbius's compound. And the compound is lush with running water. There's plants, there's grass. Seems like he's living a pretty nice life there. And Morbius provides the three crewmen a dinner. And he explains that Robbie is strong, possesses a replicator that can essentially reproduce anything he could possibly ever want. And he's blindly obedient, but unable to harm humans. And Morbius proves this by having Robbie hold Adam's own blaster right between the commander's eyes. And then Morbius orders him to fire, but Robbie cannot obey that order. Morbius reveals that he and his wife were the only members of the Bellerophon to immune to the horrific death that would ultimately end up happening on Altair 4. Every other member of that crew was ripped limb from limb by some sort of unseen stalking force. And he says that he even senses the force is that's on this planet is still lurking and still watching over things, but for whatever reason does not harm him. Nor does it harm Altera, his daughter, and she makes her presence known, much to the men's excitement. Like I said, this movie is exceptionally horny, but she's also pretty excited about this. She's never met young men before, and now there are 3 right there in her house. And if she goes back to where the ship is, there's about 20 more over there that I'm sure would be very happy to see her as well. But she also shows off her menagerie, as she has deer and a pet tiger. But Morbius loans Robbie out to Adams to help with some repairs and communicates for communication back to Earth. Now, the next day, Farman sneaks off with Altera, who has come along with Robbie as he's kind of helping out back at the ship's home base. And Farman kind of basically convinces her to engage in some kissing for stimulation. Adams finds them and dresses Farman down, and then he tells Altera that her revealing clothing is dangerous around these men who have been in hyperspace for over a year with no sight of any other women. And he basically tells her to get lost, and she laments to her father about how he spoke to her, how he talked about her clothing, and he kind of gets the impression that maybe not only is Farman interested in her, but maybe so is Commander Adams. Now, after Morbius gets back to his work, she asks Robbie to design a new dress for her that would be more appropriate based on Adams' complaints about how she dresses. And that night at the ship, guards comment on hearing a heavy breathing as something unseen walks past them and sabotages equipment stored on the ship. Adams and Doc go to question Morbius, trying to get to the bottom of who or what might have snuck aboard the ship to mess with their stuff. And Adams decides to apologize to Altera for how he spoke to her the day before. And by apologize, I mean he wants to hug and kiss her. And when Altera's pet tiger appears to prowl for the attack, Adams is forced to atomize it with his blaster to protect them. She's a little bit more in shock than she is upset about the loss of her pet tiger. She's confused that the tiger didn't seem to recognize her at all. So whatever was keeping her safe from this dangerous animal, it's no longer in place. Now, Adams and Doc sneak into Morbius's office only to find that he doesn't appear to be there. But there are notes in a strange language sitting on top of his desk. And Morbius comes out of a passageway that leads into a cavernous series of tunnels and various other compounds under the ground. And they learn about the species that inhabited this planet, the Krell. And Morbius tells the tale of how the Krell was an ancient species that had massively advanced technology, and he was able to build Robbie the robot with some of that technology that he learned from the Krell artifacts he found. He then takes the 2 officers on a tour of the immense underground structure built by the Krell, and this is essentially a gigantic cube-shaped machine that self-repairs and supplies its own power. Even long after the Krell have all gone extinct, this thing still exists and this thing is still operating. Adams believes this needs to be shared with Earth because it's an immense power source. But Morbius says that humanity is not ready for such limitless power, even in the 23rd century. Now, back at the ship, an electrified fence is erected around the ship, but the unseen creature passes through it with barely any issue. It goes on board the ship and kills another member of the crew. And when the crew tells Adams, Morbius is worried that all of the things that happened 20 years prior are beginning to happen again. And Morbius tries to warn Adams that he's seen a vision of what will happen if they don't leave as soon as possible. And that night, the crew is attacked by a giant invisible monster that ultimately is able to show up because of it trying to cross through the electrified fence. It does create like a shape, so you kind of get an idea of what the monster kind of looks like. Which basically looks like just a gigantic, like angry, rampaging creature that's about, I'd say probably about 10 feet tall. And the monster ultimately ends up killing 3 more members of the crew. Jerry Farman was one that was killed at that point. And that night's events appear to Altera in her dreams. So Adams gives the commands to basically pack everything up because they got to get out of there. They've now lost multiple people. So he goes to Morbius's place with Doc, and they're met at the door by Robbie, who tells them in no uncertain terms he is ordered to not let anyone inside. But Altera calls him off and overrides the order. And while Adams attempts to convince Altera to leave the planet with him, Doc sneaks into the Krell headquarters of the underground facility in an attempt to use this intellect enhancer that Morbius even said that when he first arrived and first discovered it, he used it on himself. Now, it gave him a shock and he passed out and he was out for about a day and a half. But when he woke up, he was twice as smart as he was before. And so Doc decides that he wants to do the same thing, basically to gain knowledge, 1, and 2, to basically be able to help try to figure out how to survive everything that's been going on. But when he tries to activate it, he receives a fatal shock from it. But he does have enough information now to warn Adams about basically what is attacking them, which he refers to as monsters from the id. Basically, the machine gave the Krell's subconscious desires freedom, and the machine creates anything by thought wherever on the planet. And Adams figures out that the machine was built by the Krell, and all those individual Krell minds have basically fed into this machine, and they all are basically running off of their own id, which still has like ancient inbred ideas of hate and segregation and all the negative thoughts that any intelligent creature could have has been basically built up by this machine and could be creating a monster like this. But here's the kicker. Once all the Krell died, the monster would have died with it. I think Morbius said it was 2,000 generations or 2,000 centuries, one or the other, since the last Krell lived. So where's this monster coming from? Well, when Morbius used the intellect enhancer on himself, he basically refed the machinery and created his own version of this creature, another monster from, this time, his id. Altera is now in danger because she has emotionally attached herself to Adams. That's why the tiger attacked her, because that was something that was made from this machinery and this technology of the Krell. And when she fell in love with Adams, it basically separated her from her father. And Robbie is unable to kill the creature or attack the creature effectively because it is a psychic projection of Morbius. So Robbie identifies that as being a piece of Morbius's own brain power, basically, or another personality that's separated from himself. When the creature chases Morbius, Altera, and Adams into the underground Krell structure, Morbius finally realizes that it was indeed his own evil self that this thing was created. Basically, it was his buried subconscious that's lashing out in defense of a kind of selfish desire to own all of this technology for himself. So ultimately, he used it to create a lonely empire for just himself and his daughter. And now, when that has been threatened, it started killing people once again. He rebukes the creature, causing it to fade away and disappear. But before he dies, he asks Adams to activate the planet's self-destruct system. Adams and Altera return to the ship with Robbie, and they fly away to witness the destruction of Altair 4. All right, so let's talk about 3 things I like about Forbidden Planet. First, this movie looks fantastic, even 70 years later. The effects work on this was nominated for an Oscar at the 29th Academy Awards, but it ultimately lost to the only other film nominated in the category, The Ten Commandments. But I kind of promise you that there are moments in this movie that look more modern than that one did back then, even today. And there are some beautiful space shots in the early parts of the movie. There's this wonderful shot of the star Altair that C-57D flies in front of while the star is getting eclipsed. I mean, it looks every bit as modern as 2001 Star Wars or Star Trek a decade or two later. While some of the planet-side sets do look like sets like a Star Trek episode from the 60s, the design work of Dr. Morbius's compound looks very cool. It's like a mid-century pop futuristic design, but really is in space. And oh my gosh, the underground Krell structure. I mean, the effects work that's put into making that look real, making this gigantic structure with these itty bitty little version of our characters walking through that structure. It's an amazing piece of special effects work, from the mid 50s. And it's just a very cool and just a really good looking movie. Even today. And I know that it's gotten some high definition transfers and stuff, which make it, just look that much better already. But it really is a marvel of, special effects from that era of the mid 50s. Second, of course, I really like Robbie the Robot. I bet no one else has ever said that before, but, first of all, he just waddles around and does stuff for people, but he also kind of does things for people with a little bit of a sigh, like he's almost put upon at times, but he's also incredibly helpful nonetheless. Like, he can't not be helpful, but you can tell sometimes he just gets tired of being asked for things. I like that when the cook on the ship asked where he can get some of the quote unquote real stuff, his term for booze, Robbie at first doesn't understand what he's asking for, but then realizes, oh, he's asking for bourbon. So he takes the bottle of hooch and guzzles it to analyze it. And then, while the guy seems irritated that he's drinking the last of his booze, Robbie's just like, hey, would 60 gallons be sufficient for your needs, booze hound? And the guy's just over the moon by it. And yeah, sure enough, a couple of days later, Robbie returns with 480 pints of of the booze. And so, it's there's silly stuff like that goes on. But when Altera asks for a new dress so that she can be more appealing or appeasing to Commander Adams, Robbie sighs and asks another, she asks him all the time for a new dress again and again and again. But, when he joins Adams' crew, he even, says cliched things like, aye, aye, skipper, when given an order. I mean, this robot ultimately has zero emotion, but also has a personality and a little bit of a sense of humor. He's a really kind of great character. And in a way, you could probably argue that, again, that kind of inspires Star Trek and Star Trek Next Generation when you have characters like Spock and Data that don't have emotions. And, of course, Data himself being an android, that's much closer even to Robbie the Robot. But third, I really like the idea of the monsters from the id in this movie. I mean, that's a very Doctor Who or Star Trek type of creature. The idea that someone's own subconscious basically reaches out when combined with unimaginable power and technology is just very much a classic hard sci-fi concept. It's the idea that not only is the technology powerful and dangerous, but what happens if that mixes with one's own desires and sometimes uncontrollable rage bubbling in the recesses of that person's mind. No matter how much you push that down, or no matter how much you try to move past those kind of almost what's the word here? Almost like the worst part of you that you think you've risen above, it's still there, and sometimes it just sneaks out in your subconscious. So what happens if that mixes with something that can bring that sort of thing to life, because the technology is so far advanced and so powerful to be able to do that? That's just a really cool idea. That also has a little bit of scariness to it. In some ways, it's like making your nightmares a real thing. But it's a big, strange idea that's fairly highbrow, but also easy to explain. And it's so different compared to other 50s sci-fi stuff that was coming out right at the same time and even a little bit after. For the most part, the sci-fi tropes went to, oh, there's a planet, or oh, there's a spaceship, or oh, there's a robot. It didn't really get into the ideas like this movie had of, these dreamlike, nightmarish creatures that are coming to life and actually, as Dr. Morbius put it, tearing people limb from limb. That's a really neat idea. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Monday show at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload that stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, it's a real howl as a temperamental teenager is transformed into a real dog as Michael Landon stars in I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Until next week, stay spooky.